Hello, thank you for joining today's Health Effects Institute webinar. My name is Gabriela Daza and I'm a research assistant here at HEI. Before I turn it over to our moderator and delve into the webinar, I'd like to make a few housekeeping announcements. First, all attendees are muted for the duration of the webinar. You can turn on closed captioning at the bottom of your screen on the right of the Q&A button. We will have a little time between presentations for 1 or 2 questions, but we will reserve about 30 minutes at the end for a more extensive Q&A discussion period. Please submit questions via the Q&A function at any time during the webinar. And if you experience any logistical difficulties, please also contact us using the Q&A box. HEI is a nonprofit corporation chartered in 1980 as an independent research organization that provides impartial science to inform decisions that foster a healthier environment and better health for all. Since 2022, HEI Energy's research program has supported research to improve our understanding of potential population exposures associated with unconventional oil and gas development in the United States. We have supported a total of 9 studies, 2 that are wrapping up on water-related exposures in Colorado and Pennsylvania, both of which explore the relationship between oil and gas development and instances of water contamination. A 3rd water-related study is currently underway and is building a regional groundwater model to understand well water vulnerability to contamination from oil spills, spills associated with oil and gas development across the Marcellus region. 3 studies are underway that seek to assess trends in air quality and community exposures from unconventional oil and gas in regions across the United States. And finally, what we will hear about today is the Tracking Community Exposures and Releases, TRACER, collaborative to better understand population exposures to air emissions and noise from oil and gas development in multiple United States regions. Before I turn things over, I would like to acknowledge my co-organizers at HEI and thank our speakers and moderator for joining us. Now I'm very happy to introduce our moderator, Dr. Kirsten Kohler. Dr. Kirsten Kohler is a professor in the Department of Environmental Health and Engineering at Johns Hopkins University. She's an exposure scientist with a focus on ambient and indoor air pollution. Her research goals are to improve exposure assessment methods, including cost-effective approaches to quantify spatial and temporal variability in air pollutants to ultimately understand how these exposures impact health. Kirsten has been a member of the HEI Energy Research Committee since 2024. Okay, take it away, Kirsten.
Great, thank you. So I want to give a little background about the project. After an extensive review of the literature by HEI's Energy Research Committee, the literature on assessing potential exposures to OGD activities showed that there was a need for better exposure quantification. While a great deal of scientific literature reports on air quality near such development, the specific sources of the contamination are rarely understood. So the research committee and HEI staff developed a call for proposals to provide tools and measurements to improve the exposure quantification. Multiple great research proposals came in, and the committee chose 3. The committee members then worked with the research teams to tailor the projects to best meet their overall research needs and identify that a collaboration between the 3 teams was the best way forward. HEI's energy program funded the TRACER collaboration, which seeks to identify and understand potential links between short-term and long-term population exposures and specific oil and gas development processes. The collaboration involves air quality monitoring and modeling components. The TRACER model predicts chemical emissions and their effects on both local and regional air quality. Understanding the effects of local air quality is important for determining science-based setback distances that separate operations from sensitive land uses, such as homes and schools. Emissions from oil and gas operations more broadly can contribute to concentrations of regional contaminants like ozone. The model can be adapted for use anywhere in the United States, and as emissions from oil and gas operations change over time, the TRACER model can be modified to account for and reflect corresponding changes in potential exposure. Initially, the model has been developed and evaluated for use in the Denver-Julesburg region of Colorado, the Eagle Ford Shale region of Texas, and the Marcellus region, which intersects parts of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. We hope you enjoy the event, and now I'll welcome our first speakers. Dr. Leah Hildebrandt Ruiz is an associate professor in the McHetta Department of Chemical Engineering at the University of Texas, Austin. Her research focuses on the formation, transformation, and atmospheric fate of air pollutants to make better informed recommendations for environmental policies aimed at improving air quality and human health. Her team uses a combination of state-of-the-science instrumentation in laboratory experiments and to make field measurements in indoor and outdoor environments, as well as mathematical modeling. She's joined by Dr. David Allen, who is the Norbert Dietrich Welch Chair in Chemical Engineering and the co-director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Systems Analyses at the University of Texas, Austin. He has led multiple air quality studies, has served as a chair for EPA's Science Advisory Board, and was elected to the National Academy of Engineering. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for the introduction. I'll briefly introduce our project and our project team, and then I'll hand it over to Dr. Allen for the presentation of our modeling results. Because the focus of our project is to develop this model to evaluate community exposures to air pollutants from unconventional oil and gas development. And this project at UT Austin was conducted by a large collaborative team. Most of us are based at UT Austin, and then also Dr. Lucas Henneman is at George Mason University, as well as many graduate students and postdocs and research scientists that assisted with this work. If you want to go to the next slide. Or maybe even one more. So this is just pictures of the PIs and co-PIs, as well as a list of all project participants. Our project was driven by wanting to generate this model, the TRACER model, that will be broadly applicable and can assess exposures to air pollutants from unconventional oil and gas development and help inform future health studies. The model is basically a combination of an emissions model that can then be coupled to dispersion or chemical transport models. As part of this project, we also conducted targeted field measurements that helped us evaluate and refine the model. We presented the results of those field measurements in the first webinar that took place about 2 weeks ago. So today we're going to focus on the results from the modeling work, which was led by my colleague, Dr. Allen. So go ahead.
Thank you, Leah. Today, what I'd like to do is give you a broad overview of this coupled emissions and transport of pollutant modeling that's been done in the context of the TRACER work. I'll begin just by talking a little bit about our work on estimating emissions from unconventional oil and gas development and our approaches to doing that and the aspects of the emission models that we've been focused on improving. Then I'll describe how we've coupled those emissions models with dispersion models, and also how we've coupled emission models with chemical transport models, each with a different type of air quality impact in mind. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about applying the modeling framework to different production regions and give you a sense of what those data products will look like. All of this will be at a very high level. There'll be much more detail available in publications and the final report to the HEI. Let me begin then with estimating emissions from unconventional oil and gas development. We've been focused on a number of different types of emissions, but before I describe those, let me give you a sense of the challenge we face. This is a modeling of methane emissions from unconventional oil and gas development in a production region in north central Texas called the Barnett Shale. You're seeing hour-on-hour emission variability associated with methane emissions just from unconventional oil and gas development over roughly a 200 kilometer by 200 kilometer domain, where the white lines here represent county lines. And what this animation is designed to show you is the extensive spatial and temporal variability in these emissions. And so what we want to be able to do is to develop emission inventories that capture this spatial and temporal variability. In addition, we need to estimate emissions for multiple chemical species. There's been a lot of work done on methane, and you're seeing methane here, but we're interested in many other types of species, criteria air pollutants and hazardous air pollutants, and we need to be able to characterize differences in emission compositions for different sources. Finally, we want to take all of these research methods that we've been developing and convert them into user-friendly methods so that a wide variety of community stakeholders can apply these different tools for estimating emissions. So this is the problem that we're aiming to solve. We're looking at a great many different types of sources, some of them during the pre-production stage, either drilling or completion and hydraulic fracturing of systems, and then a variety in the production stages. And this is just a list from our final report of the various different categories of emissions that we're looking at. There are a lot of them here. Clearly, I can't describe all of them in the limited time we have today. So what I want to do is just very briefly describe one example that I'll return to on spatial and temporal allocation of emissions, getting at that variability that we were looking at a moment ago. And then I'd like to spend a little bit more time describing the work we've been developing on characterizing the compositions of these different types of emission sources. So for all these different source categories that are listed, we want to be able to estimate what the compositions of the emissions will be. So let's first just look at that very briefly, and we'll return to this in a moment, at the spatial and temporal allocation. And I'm going to use as an example hydraulic fracturing emissions, and particularly NOx emissions from hydraulic fracturing operations. So in most emission inventories, the data that we get on spatial variability or spatial distribution of the emissions is at a county level. And the emission totals are given as an annual average. And let's just look at the example of hydraulic fracturing. This is an event that occurs not at a county level, but at specific well sites. It's not well spatially distributed. It's occurring at the wells where the hydraulic fracturing is occurring. And also, it's not occurring uniformly over an entire year. It's occurring in relatively short periods of time, approximately a week of activity. That produces, at any given well location, it produces a concentration of emissions. And that concentration of emissions, in this case, where the example I'm going to give you a little bit later is of NOx emissions, that spatial and temporal concentration of the emissions can lead to enhancement of ozone formation and other types of criteria air pollutant concerns. We'll return to this in just a little bit, but throughout all these emission categories, we're looking at the spatial and temporal distribution of what the emissions are. We also want to look at the composition or the speciation of these sources. And just to give you a sense of how this might vary and why it might vary, let's look at a well site where a mixture of fluids, typically gas, hydrocarbon liquids, and water, comes off of a wellhead and goes to a separator that separates out the water stream, separates out a liquid hydrocarbon stream, and then separates out a gas stream. That gas stream then goes to subsequent downstream processing. But as we go through these different steps, the separation, the downstream processing, the composition of the gas in the processes vary. Just to give you an example, the hydrocarbons that might be vented by a condensate tank, shown in the middle right of this diagram, that might have much higher concentrations of heavier hydrocarbons than, for example, leaks or other emissions that might occur from the gas phase that leaves the separator. And so what we need to be able to do is to assemble data and then estimate data on these emissions from these various different sources. The differences in composition can be significant. And so we've collected large amounts of public data. We've developed speciation or emission composition data sets, and we've extended some of the tools that we had previously developed to include key species such as the BTEX compounds, benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylenes. We've assembled that information into these data sets. Here, I show an example of data, publicly available data, that we were able to collect in Texas. I won't walk you through all the details of this, but what we've done is county by county estimate what emission compositions would be. This particular map of Texas, described in detail in our report, gives the type of data that we have in each county, with, in this example, the yellow lines representing data where we, or counties where we have specific data on the composition of the gas produced in those regions, and we've estimated all the other compositions based on that. The areas that aren't, or the counties that aren't outlined in yellow, are counties where we've estimated what compositions are based on production basin averages or other metrics. But what we've done is to try and assemble the best available public data that we're aware of to give users as accurate a possible method of estimating what all these different compositions are. We've then also extended some of our previous calculations based on thermodynamics to evaluate BTEX and other compounds that might be hazardous air pollutants. So what that involves is doing hundreds of thousands of thermodynamic calculations to develop a searchable data set that allows you, if you know the conditions at a particular well site, allows you to search through data and get the best available composition of these emissions. And we've done that for a variety of different compounds and assembled those data throughout Texas. And also we've done that in the Marcellus Basin. And so we've taken the cases we've had in the Eagle Ford. We've estimated the composition of BTEX compounds and alkanes based on thermodynamics and developed a usable data set that allows us to get at those compositions. So this is a little bit of a summary slide on those compositions. For all those different sources that I listed at the beginning, it lists specifically where we've made contributions to changing what we know about the composition. So looking at these different categories, you can see where we have used existing data, such as EPA's oil and gas tool, but then also the large number of categories where we have study-specific gas compositions and emission compositions. So that's a very quick overview of the work that we've been doing on emissions. The key findings are that these unconventional oil and gas development emission sources have very complex spatial and temporal distributions. And those distributions can impact a variety of different types of exposures. Further, these unconventional oil and gas development emission sources not only can vary over time and space, but they also have variable compositions, source-specific compositions. So we've developed source-by-source calculation methods for estimating particularly the spatial and temporal distribution of emissions, and to extend the information that we have based on the composition of those of those emissions, either based on publicly available data or on thermodynamic modeling and process simulation. So that's the first part of this 4-part description of the modeling that we've been doing. Once we develop these emissions, how do we estimate what the exposures are? How do we couple them with atmospheric models? And I'm going to begin by describing the work that we've been doing with dispersion modeling. And I'm going to use as an example of this our work in the Eagle Ford Shale. So what I'm showing in the upper right plot on this slide is a time series taken over the course of the calendar year 2023 of hourly ethane concentrations at a regional receptor site. And I'll show you the approximate location of that regional receptor site relative to the sources over the course of a year. And I want you to notice a number of things about that time series of ethane concentrations, ethane being a good marker for unconventional oil and gas development in this particular region. First thing I'd like you to notice is, again, that strong temporal variability, in this case at a particular point in space. Average values for ethane concentrations that are on the order of 10 parts per billion. But maxima that extend up to 800 parts per billion or more. Second thing I'd like you to notice, in addition to the temporal variability, is the relatively short duration of these elevated concentrations. The final thing that isn't evident from the upper plot, but so I've created a set of bar charts in the lower diagram on the right, is if we look at the 99th percentile of the concentration, so just the highest concentration, and ask what time of day do we see these elevated concentrations, what you see is that we have almost all of the most elevated concentrations occurring at night and in early morning hours, relatively few during the middle part of the day. And so this is true not only for ethane. I'm using ethane here as a representative example. It's true, and Professor Hildebrandt Ruiz's team made measurements of these BTEX compounds, of heavier alkanes, of other species. So this is a broadly representative behavior for the time of day pattern of the most elevated concentrations and the averages. So highly variable observed concentrations, short duration peak concentrations observed primarily at night. I'm showing this for the Eagle Ford, but we've also seen this in other production regions, for example, the Permian, and for other species, heavier alkanes, benzene, and so on. So what are the causes of these elevated concentrations, especially given this day-night behavior, the diurnal pattern of the concentrations? Well, we examined with the analyses that we did 3 particular hypotheses. One is that this might just be a regional phenomenon, that it's associated with a regional diurnal pattern of the boundary layer. And I won't go into that in this brief presentation today. Done a number of analyses of this. While the collapse of the boundary layer is important, it's not the only phenomenon that's occurring to produce these high concentrations, or the only meteorological phenomenon. The 2 primary causes of these elevated concentrations at night are both are important, but one is routine emissions, so emissions that are not particularly unusual, but routine emissions coupled with low nighttime wind speeds and low nighttime mixing heights. And the second possibility, and again, this occurs, and we need to distinguish between these two, is non-routine emission events, large emission events that are outside the norm of the routine emissions. And so a key question then is what fraction of the emissions are due to routine emissions coupled with meteorological variability, and what fraction are due to non-routine emissions. And so we spent a lot of time analyzing this. And so let me describe to you a little bit the location. On the left, you see a mapping of the area around Karnes City where the sampling was done. Receptor location is in the middle. Each of those little white pads, if you're not familiar with this, are oil and gas facilities and the pads associated with those oil and gas facilities. So even within about 20 kilometers or so of the receptor location, we have a great many individual sites. As I'll show you in just a moment, in order to explain the observations that we were getting at the receptor sites, we had to look not only at the immediate vicinity, in this case, immediate vicinity might be within 20 kilometers or so, but we also had to look quite a bit further out. As you go further and further out, there are more potential facilities that might be contributing to the observations at a central location. And so what we did was go all the way out to 100 kilometers from the sampling location from the receptor site. We looked at a total domain of roughly 200 kilometers by 200 kilometers in order to be able to explain what we were seeing at that central location. And let me just be a bit quantitative about that in the next slide. So in order to explain the mean observed, in this case, ethane concentration at that receptor site, sources within about 5 kilometers of that receptor site accounted for a little under 40% of the mean value of the concentrations. To get to 2/3 of the mean value being explained on average, we had to go out to 10 kilometers. To get to almost 90%, we had to go out to 20 kilometers, and essentially to get to all of the concentrations that we would predict from this 100 kilometer by 100 kilometer domain, we needed to go all the way out to 50 kilometers. So these results are peculiar to the Eagle Ford in the sense of the exact fractions associated with various distances from the receptor site. But we expect that they'll be broadly applicable, that the large numbers of wells located at 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers, 40 kilometers from a receptor site will have an influence on mean concentrations and therefore exposures at some central receptor site. So we need to be thinking, given the very large number of sources, about pretty large modeling domains to be able to assess exposure. So we kept track, and I'll go back here, we kept track in that central pink domain in the map. We kept track of every location. There are roughly 20,000 or so well sites in this 100 kilometer by 100 kilometer domain. So to keep the computations a little bit tractable, as we got further out to the outer part of the domain, we lumped all of the sources within a 4 kilometer by 4 kilometer area into one single source point, and then modeled that source point as representative of the entire grid. We didn't do that near the receptor site, only as we got further away where the exact placement of the sources would not be as important. Still, we were modeling thousands of different source points to be able to accurately represent what was happening at the receptors. We then did detailed dispersion modeling. So at each of those thousands of individual sites, where we were modeling emissions, we modeled dispersion and estimated what the concentrations from each site, from each source would be at the receptor site. Quite computationally intensive. And this gives you a sense of what the wind directions are. So how did we do? How does doing this emission modeling coupled with dispersion modeling using the best available formulation of the dispersion model we had with all the meteorological data that we could collect, how well did we do? Here's the first of these plots that I'd like to show you, and I'm comparing now observations as a function of time of day versus our modeling. Again, predictions versus time of day. And then I'm showing you in particular, excuse me, the 75th percentiles of the concentrations. And this is one way to represent the results. I personally find a time series more instructive. And so here is a time series over a course of our measurement campaign period in the Eagle Ford at Karnes City. And so what you see in blue are our emission models, accounting only for routine emissions, no upsets, no unreported emissions, just the routinely reported emissions that we're able to calculate versus the observations in orange. And what I'd like to point out to you in particular is that a relatively large number of elevated concentrations at night are explained by the routine emissions that we see day after day, hour after hour, with relatively little variability. However, you also see incidents over this roughly 2-month period that are non-routine, that are not explained well by the routine observations. And we attribute these to emission events that aren't captured as part of the routine emissions. So both are important, both the routine emissions and the non-routine emissions, the large emission events. But to distinguish between these, a lot of effort needs to go into the emission inventory development together with then the dispersion modeling. Further, I'd like to point out to you that many of these sources for the highest observed concentration, so let me go back for a moment and point out to you the highest of the blue peaks. If we take the highest of those blue peaks hour on hour and ask how far away were the sources that are contributing to those routine emissions, accounting for highly elevated concentrations. What you see is here are the top 20 hours at night. And what you see from the various colors are how far away the sources were. And certainly a number of the highest concentrations are due to very nearby sources within 5 kilometers or 10 kilometers. But contributions are made by sources that are up to 50 kilometers away. And so both near and far sources can contribute. This is at night, the highest enhancements that are model predicted at night. Here's the daytime. So again, nearby sources can be important, but also sources that are quite distant from the receptor site, from where we're interested in the exposures, can be quite important. I'll just point out that we didn't do this just for ethane. We've done it for other species as well. Here are results for benzene. In the case of benzene, our initial analyses focused on nighttime because although Karnes City is a small place, it does have on-road emissions, and we wanted to remove the confounding factor of potential on-road emissions of benzene. And so we looked and did our comparisons primarily at night. Again, highest modeled and predicted concentrations were at night. And we're doing a series of sensitivity analyses, not just on ethane, but on other species as well. So what are the key findings from this part? That elevated concentrations at night dominate the exposures. These elevated concentrations at night, and as well as the mean concentrations, both at night and during the day, can be caused by routine emission sources that are quite distant from the receptor. The largest concentrations are driven by sources that tend to be within 20 kilometers or so of the receptor, but that's not exclusive. We do have evidence of large non-routine emissions, but they don't account, at least in the Eagle Ford, for a large fraction of the highest observed concentrations, again, that occur at night. And this emissions modeling, coupled with dispersion modeling, can be a powerful tool for characterizing exposures. And let me move on quickly then to another way of coupling our emission estimates with atmospheric models. In this case, we'll look at chemical transport models, and I'll go back to that example that I described right at the beginning of hydraulic fracturing NOx emissions that are potentially important in photochemistry and the regional impacts of emissions from unconventional oil and gas models. So most emission inventories, as I mentioned earlier, report NOx from unconventional oil and gas development annually, but they do have significant spatial and temporal variability. These in the Eagle Ford are the largest sources of NOx. Natural gas engines are well distributed. Their operation is nearly continuous, but hydraulic fracturing engines are only found at wells that are actively being fractured, and they're only operational at that given well for on the order of 7 to 10 days. So we decided, let's focus on doing spatial and temporal allocation of those fracking emissions, the NOx emissions, and see what impact that has on ozone formation. We did that in the Eagle Ford Shale again. Here are the Eagle Ford Shale counties, and we focused our attention just on Karnes County. But in the Eagle Ford Shale, it's important to recognize that there's an abundance of VOCs. So most of the ozone formation is NOx limited. And the amount of ozone formed will depend strongly on the spatial and temporal distributions of the NOx emissions. So again, we looked at Karnes County. And it's among, if not the most active production region in the entire Eagle Ford. It accounts for about 25% of the NOx emissions from hydraulic fracturing in the Eagle Ford. And importantly, it is, according to the prevailing meteorology, directly upwind of the 7th largest city in the United States, San Antonio, which is a ozone non-attainment area. So what we did was we took the standard inventory developed by the TCEQ, we removed the hydraulic fracturing emissions, and our first assumption is let's put in our estimate of NOx emissions from hydraulic fracturing, let's distribute it continuously throughout the year, and let's do it by county. And so here you see different counties with different amounts of emissions per well in the county. And so that was our initial base case. We then did a number of other cases. We did this annual even allocation to all the wells. But then we said, well, the emissions are only really occurring in the 436 wells that were actually fractured. And then we looked at 4 scenarios with, or 3 scenarios with different durations of the hydraulic fracturing in each case. So our total amount of emissions at any given site, the total remains the same for the county for the year, but at any given day, at any given site, the amount of NOx that's released and that emission rate could change by 2 to 3 orders of magnitude. Again, the total, countywide total remains the same. It's the spatial and temporal distribution that changes. And so we then put that in the model used by the TCEQ for SIP attainment demonstration in the SIP episode for the San Antonio region. We put in those different cases, calculated hourly concentrations at all grid cells, looked at daily maximum 8-hour average ozone concentrations in all the grid cells, and looked at differences between case 1 and these other various cases. And I'll show you case 3, which assumed that hydraulic fracturing would last for a week. We think that's our nominal best case simulation. And so this is the sort of difference that you see in ozone concentration associated with that. You see the plume coming from Karnes County. If you look carefully, you see some in Karnes County, some NOx titration of ozone. And downwind, you see enhancement of ozone by the more concentrated NOx emissions, both in time and space. And I'm going to show you an animation next that will show you these differences not at an hourly snapshot, but over the course of August. This particular hourly snapshot gave us a difference between the annual county level ozone prediction and our spatially and temporally allocated emission of 9 parts per billion of ozone. And so this is what it looks like over the course of a month for the different patterns. We've now published this work. It's appeared in the journal ACS ES&T Air. If you want more details, you can look at it at that publication. But because of the spatial and temporal concentration of the emissions, an emission rate at any given point could vary by 2 to 3 orders of magnitude. That in turn influences predicted ozone concentrations, which can have significant air quality and regulatory implications in non-attainment areas like San Antonio. And similar results might be expected for other sources like drilling activity that have that spatial and temporal concentration. Finally, I'll just use a couple of minutes here at the end to apply this, look at applying the modeling framework to production regions. Our work is looking at both the Eagle Ford, where I explained to you this 200 kilometer by 200 kilometer domain and all the emissions that we developed there, site by site. We're doing the same thing in the region that you see enclosed in the reddish color for the Marcellus domain. So again, applying those same types of emission estimation techniques. I don't have time to go over this with you in a great deal of detail. Details will be available in our final report, which is currently under review by HEI. But just to give you a sense, here I've developed a gridded inventory mapping for ethane, showing average emission rates, annual average emission rates by grid cell. And these are 4 kilometer by 4 kilometer grid cells. We could have done this gridding at any spatial resolution we chose. I chose this sort of gridded, but I've contrasted that with the maximum hourly emission rates that our models are predicting. And you can contrast average and maximum and the spatial distributions of those. Here's the same thing for benzene, showing average emission rates and maximum emission rates. And then here's just to show you some sample results from the Marcellus. Here's a particular grid cell in the Marcellus showing VOC emissions in kilograms per hour and a time series of that over the course of a year, showing that we have base level emissions, but also the potential for enhancement of those base level emissions due to phenomena like completion activities, liquid unloading activities, other types of relatively short duration events that can cause significant perturbations hour on hour in the VOC emission inventories. There are lots of different ways to construct these, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the types of emission inventories that we're developing. So again, what I've tried to very quickly give you a sense of the modeling work underway is how we're going about estimating emissions from unconventional oil and gas development, particularly focusing on spatial and temporal variability along with compositions, how we then couple those emissions with dispersion models, how we couple those emission estimates with chemical transport models, and then how we can apply these techniques to entire production regions and look at various ways of interpreting the emission inventories. So thank you for this opportunity to present our work. And with this, I think my slides have ended. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Allen, for that presentation. I'll now introduce our speakers for our second presentation of the afternoon. Dr. Jeff Collett is a university distinguished professor in the Department of Atmospheric Science at Colorado State University. His group has conducted field studies of air quality and atmospheric chemistry in more than 40 locations in the United States, Asia, Europe, and South America. His research interests include pollution processing by clouds and fogs, nitrogen deposition, air quality impacts from unconventional oil and gas development, and regional air quality, among others. He's joined by Dr. Da Pan, who earned his BS from Peking University and completed his PhD in civil and environmental engineering at Princeton University. He then joined Colorado State University as a postdoctoral fellow, where his research focused on nitrogen deposition and volatile organic compound emissions from unconventional oil and gas. He's now an assistant professor in the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten. And can you confirm, hopefully you can all see the slide up now in full screen mode?
Looks good to me.
Thank you. So we had a project also as part of this TRACER study, and we were primarily focused on observations, and we spoke about those in the webinar a couple of weeks ago, but we also had a smaller modeling component that we wanted to share with you today. We're grateful to HEI Energy for sponsoring this work. I've listed the co-authors here from Colorado State University, including Da Pan, who will help me present this work. And I'd like to also acknowledge contributions from our other collaborators at the Colorado School of Public Health and the State of Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, who work primarily on the measurement and observation side of this project. So in the webinar a couple of weeks ago, we talked about our observations, and what we were doing there was basically deploying different assets around individual well pads as they went through well development, so drilling completions into early production. Overall, we were looking in the Denver-Julesburg Basin of Northeast Colorado. As you can see here, we had 3 different locations we studied. We worked with 3 different oil and gas operators who were operating those facilities, and we had a total of 4 different well pads that we were studying. What we're really interested here is looking quite close to these operations that are undergoing specific activities during the pre-production and early production life cycle of well development. And if you're familiar with these kinds of operations, or even if you just look at this aerial photograph, you can see the type of equipment, for example, that's on site during a drilling operation versus a hydraulic fracturing operation, or not shown here, a flowback operation, vary a lot. So we expect emissions, both amounts and composition from that equipment to vary. There's also a big difference in terms of the contact between the subsurface hydrocarbon deposit and the atmosphere. During drilling, for example, we're bringing material from the wellbore back up to the surface where it can outgas, whereas, for example, during fracking operations, materials being pushed down and pressurized in the wellbore, and there's little chance for subsurface emissions to come out into the atmosphere. There also are important choices that operators and their subcontractors make in terms of the details of each of these types of activities. So for example, in drilling, you might see a diesel, a natural gas powered, or as we saw in our study, grid powered electrified drill rigs. There are different choices of drilling muds. For example, more conventional petroleum-based muds, or increasingly popular lower odor synthetic-based muds. And we'll talk about some of those differences as well. On the flowback side, when fluids are being brought back out of the well following hydraulic fracturing, there also can be big differences in terms of how those flowback fluids are handled and the potential for emission to the atmosphere. And we've seen increasing deployment in recent years of closed-loop tankless systems, which, as we'll show you, can greatly reduce some of the VOC emissions during this key step of new well development. So as part of our project, we developed what we're calling the TRACER pre-production model. And this is focused on emissions from an individual well pad that's undergoing a series of operations to drill and complete new wells and move them into production. And Da will be talking to you in more detail about this, but basically you can define a detailed operational timeline for those operations. Depending on the nature of those operations, you can select appropriate emissions factors and predict emission timelines that can be translated using a dispersion model into varying concentration fields around that operation to look, for example, at exposure within, say, 1 kilometer of this particular operation. One of the things that we really had to do here to improve our ability to model these was to come up with a good set of emission factors and to supplement what was available in the literature to really represent modern UOGD operations. So we used data sources that were available in the literature. You heard already from Dr. Allen about the EPA oil and gas emission tool, for example. We also published a paper in 2019 that was based on studies in Colorado, in the Piceance Basin in western Colorado, and the DJ Basin in eastern Colorado, where we characterized specific emissions from these different pre-production operational phases. But even between these two data sources, there are a number of key gaps and limitations. For example, neither of these represent all of these different operations. A key one that's missing is what we've referred to here as coiled tubing or mill-out operations. This is the stage after hydraulic fracturing is finished, which is done in stages where they go in and they mill out the plugs that are used to isolate those stages during the fracking process. And this allows venting material to the atmosphere. There also have been important evolution in operational practices. For example, I mentioned the increasing popularity of some synthetic drilling fluids to help control odor impacts, and changes to, for example, these tankless closed loop fluid handling systems during flowback. And then finally, as you also heard from Dr. Allen, often these resources don't include full speciation of a wide range of VOCs. In particular, a lot of the emissions included in the EPA tool might have methane, maybe non-methane hydrocarbons, maybe BTEX, but often not a lot beyond a few individual compounds. So in order to try and fill some of these gaps and update to more current kinds of situations in terms of emissions, we took advantage of another project that we've been working on recently in the DJ Basin. This is in Broomfield, Colorado. This work was sponsored by the city and county of Broomfield. And here, over several years, we monitored at as many as 19 locations around these well pads shown by these polygons. We monitored VOCs and other information about emissions. What we did then was to use these observations as these different well pads were being sequentially developed and combine those with a dispersion model. We used the EPA AirMod tool to translate emissions from the pad into concentration fields. And we basically use the concentration observations then to adjust the emission rate from each of these different sources simultaneously so that we got the best match between predicted concentration fields and our observations. And to test how well this worked, we took advantage of a fairly unique set of compounds that are a good tracer for the use of a synthetic drilling mud based on a drilling fluid from Shell called NeoFlow. And we've done some work characterizing emissions from this NeoFlow-based drilling mud, both in the laboratory and in the field. And you can see for a set of key compounds here, you get a very consistent pattern in terms of their relative concentrations in emission plumes. And in particular, we focused on 3 of these compounds, octane, nonane, and decane. These are basically longer chain versions of alkanes like ethane or propane. And we then looked at how well our optimized model could predict the concentrations of those tracer compounds associated with outgassing of the synthetic-based drilling mud with observations. So you can see that here for these larger alkanes, our predicted enhancements above the background compared to the observed enhancements. And we see that the model, when we do this constraint, this inversion technique, does a pretty good job across all of our monitoring sites at reproducing that concentration pattern. What you can't see in this particular plot, but we also saw, is that this inversion technique also assigns the location for the emissions of these compounds to the pads undergoing drilling and not randomly to pads undergoing other operations. So this gave us good confidence that this technique was working well to constrain emission rates of these compounds and other VOCs from these operations. And so I'll show you 3 examples of ways we've updated the database that we provide to users with this model to represent emissions of VOCs. So the first one we have updated estimates now for emission rates of about 50 different VOCs. Actually, we include here a few examples, including the use of these newer synthetic drilling fluids. So here, for example, you see these large emissions of these C8 to C10 alkanes, which make up about 20% actually of the total non-methane VOC emissions during this stage. We see that these emission rates of, say, non-methane VOCs are higher than what's in the EPA tool and higher also than what we saw in the earlier publication out of our group led by Arsena Hakobian. As a second example, here we have now the only emission estimates for coiled tubing mill-out operations. These are not available in the EPA tool or in our earlier paper by Hakobian et al. And you can see, for example, the non-methane VOC emissions here are relatively high compared to a lot of pre-production operations and fairly comparable to what we see in terms of the outgassing from the drilling mud recycling operations. And then the third example here corresponds to flowback operations. At the time we did the work that's published in Hakobian et al., we saw that the emissions of both benzene and non-methane VOCs from flowback operations were the largest among all pre-production operations. And in a health risk assessment done by the state of Colorado, it was largely this activity that drove the largest risk for people that were living near these operations. We see, however, in Broomfield, where they were using newer closed-loop tankless systems, that we get more than a 95% reduction in both non-methane VOC and benzene emissions. So this is a great indication of a modernization of flowback operations in use by some operators that can really help to reduce emissions and their impacts. By the way, I should point out that the EPA tool actually specifies 0 VOC emissions for green completions, which certainly isn't true in the type studied by Jacobian et al. But even now, we continue to see some emissions from these flowback operations. So I'll turn things over to Da now to talk a little bit about the model, how it's used and can be used by different stakeholders.
Thanks, Jeff. In the following slides, I will introduce you the pre-production model we developed for the TRACER project. So Jeff briefly talked about our framework earlier, which consists of getting the operation timeline, combine the timeline with emission factors, then use dispersion to translate emissions to concentrations and exposure levels. So based on the framework Jeff showed earlier, we developed the model in Python 3, and we created a graphical user interface GUI for the model to enhance the accessibility of simulating emissions and exposure levels in different communities. And this could be very helpful for policymaking and also research related to environmental health. So users can run the Python script directly, or on Windows, they can use the compiled exe file directly. And inputs file are in Excel sheets, so modifying and creating new inputs is relatively straightforward. Finally, we evaluated the model's performance using air monitoring results from the DJ basin. And in the following slides, I will go over the settings of configuration of the model. Next, please. Yeah, so the first thing a user needs to figure out is the operation timeline of the UOGD. So there are two options. First, if the detailed operation logs are available from the operators, like the one shown here, the GUI can read those directly and then generate a timeline to be used with the emission factors. However, the detailed logs may not be available, or the users may be interested in regional mean or typical scenarios, then they can use simulated operation timelines. So we've incorporated the mechanistic air emission simulator, MAZE model, into this GUI. The MAZE model is based on a Monte Carlo approach that randomly transition from one activity to the next based on given distributions of the activity durations. And here we've provided duration distributions obtained from real-world timelines of several UOGD projects in the DJ basin. So the user can generate ensemble of operation timelines and calculate the mean of the operation sequence or the medium sequence to be used with emission factors. Next, we need to set emission factors. So the GUI comes with 3 sets of emission factors that Jeff has shown before. We have the ones from the inverse modeling work, and we will call it John 2025, and the ones from Jacobian, and the ones from EPA emission tool. So the user can choose from the 3. They can also create their own emission factors. In addition, the user can adjust the emission factors directly within the GUI, providing flexibility and customization based on their specific knowledge about the operation or specific scenarios. Next, combine, yes, so now we have operation timeline and we combine it with emission factor, then we can get emission timelines. And to translate those timelines into concentrations and exposure levels at certain receptor, we provide two options. The first one is the Gaussian plume model. So we have parameters based on Pascal stability class built-in. And then by default, the atmospheric condition is set to moderately windy and clear sky. And we have three preset set locations for users that are not very familiar with dispersion model. But for experienced user, they can adjust stability class and wind conditions and also the receptor locations. And for even for experts that can run AirMod or other type of dispersion model, they can choose to do so. And for AirMod, it's a model that uses meteorological inputs and terrain information. So the GUI can rate AirMod outputs directly to provide better dispersion simulations. Next. Yeah, so to ensure the performance and also evaluate the emission factors, we've compared simulated concentrations with observations made near well pads in the DJ Basin. So again, Jeff has mentioned this monitoring program before. Here I'm showing you the timelines of our air monitoring. So we monitor 3 sites, and we'll use the weekly observation to compare with our simulated weekly concentrations. And also we have a triggered canister that reflect short-term acute events when we detected high concentration. As for model configuration, we use detailed operation timelines obtained from operators. And for emission factors, we use JOHN 2025 and EPA emission tool to investigate if the updated emission factors lead to better simulations. And we conducted AirMod simulations to represent dispersion processes. Next. So here is the intercomparison for weekly VOC concentrations. And we'll focus on site 1, which we monitored from the start of drilling all the way to production. And we have 5 phases shown in this plot. And blue, orange, green, and black boxes are near pad observations. Model simulated with JOHN 2025 emission factors, and simulated with green is simulated with EPA emission factors, and black are the background observations. We can see that first, the updated emission factors has more speciation. So here we have the CA to C10 N-alkanes from Zhang et al., which match the observation. And EPA emission tool does not have CA to C10 N-alkane emission factors. And then for both drilling and coil tubing for non-messing VOCs, using emission factors from JOHN 2025, we also had better agreement with observations. However, the model cannot reproduce the high emission during pre-production observed near Site 1 with neither JOHN 2025 or the EPA emission factors, which suggests that fuller investigation is needed to quantify emissions from possible changing practices, such as go into direction with a shorter period of flowback operation. And we also evaluated the model's performance in terms of reproducing hourly benzene accidents events. We focus on benzene because it has the largest contribution to the acute health impacts. So here we see, again, we'll focus on Site 3, where we see almost 12 benzene hourly accidents event near the site, especially during coil tubing and early production. So some of this might be related to several events reported by the operator at the site. Nevertheless, the low early production emission rates of Zhang et al. 2025 leads to underestimation of benzene accidents events. So we only captured 5 when the 2 well pads were going through coil tubing and production, and 0 after they enter into early production phases. By using EPA emission tool, we significantly overestimate the number of accidents events during early production. So this highlights again that emission from production phases, the size might be different from the ones we use to inverse the emission factors, and more observation and investigation are needed. With that, I will give it back to Jeff.
Thank you, Da. So just to wrap up, for this modeling part of our project, we developed this new pre-production model that's really designed to be friendly to a wide variety of stakeholders, to allow them to predict air quality impacts and their timing during specific operational phases. We often hear from residents, for example, that they'd really like to know when to expect the worst conditions during operations. The other thing is that it allows the stakeholders using the model to evaluate the air quality benefits of implementing different best management practices. For example, you could compare an electrified grid-powered drill rig versus a diesel drill rig, or a synthetic versus a conventional drilling mud choice, or the implementation of these newer closed-loop tankless fluids handling systems. You could also do things that people are thinking more and more about, like how much better or worse are the exposure potentials if we move activities to a different time of year. We also, as you saw, updated the emission rate information to better represent current UOGD practices, especially as they're employed in the DJ Basin. And as Da showed, we're getting pretty good performance for pre-production, from some challenges around early production, but we definitely need to test this type of approach in other basins as well. So we will wrap up there and turn things back over to Kirsten.
Great. Thank you for this. As a reminder to everybody on the line, we're using the Q&A feature, so please do put any comments or questions into the Q&A and we'll address them. I wanted to kick off with one question that Dr. Allen has weighed in on online, but I thought maybe Drs. Collette and Pan would want to weigh in on as well, is has the EPA considered your work in updating its tool to better reflect green completion emissions and maybe some of the other technologies you were discussing towards the end of the presentation?
Yeah, this work is just coming out, and the inversion technique we use to obtain the new emissions is not yet published. So that's a key thing for that to go through peer review, of course. But we have heard expressions of interest from people at EPA that work on the team that developed the tool, and definitely taking a look at these things. So we hope down the road this may become implemented there.
While we wait for additional questions to come in, I'll ask another question. I wonder, leave this open to anybody who wants to weigh in on what causes the differences between that you see in the concentrations between different productions and basins, not just between these two sites that we've discussed in detail today, but with other basins like the Permian, and how well does the modeling predict these differences? Please, Dr. Allen.
I'll go ahead and begin. There are lots of potential causes, and I'm sure Dr. Collette and others can weigh in with other causes, but I'll just begin with some of the most basic of the causes of differences between different basins. One is just the equipment that's present. So you go to a place like the northeastern Marcellus, where the produced product is essentially natural gas, natural gas liquids, ethane, propane, butanes to speak of, no liquid hydrocarbons. And that results in very different equipment being on the site with very different emissions on the site. And so first thing is just the types of product being produced, whether it's dry gas or wet gas or oil, and the associated equipment. Another factor that we've seen certainly, and it has been attributed, for example, to some of the historically very high emission rates in places like the Permian Basin, again, gets to this difference in the product. So, for example, one cause of various types of emissions in the Permian Basin is when you have various, let's just say, gas supply chain infrastructure shutting down. So imagine a gas processing plant needs to shut down, and suddenly for wells, there's no place for the gas to go. If on the one hand, that happens in a place like the Marcellus, which is a dry gas area, and the gas is your only product, your recourse would most generally be shut the well in, stop production. But on the other hand, in a place like the Permian, you may have both oil, natural gas liquids, and natural gas products, and therefore different operators may respond differently to parts of the supply chain getting shut down, and episodic emissions can be quite different because of those differences. So differences in operator response to various types of situations can lead to differences in the emissions. And I'll let others potentially weigh in on other types of factors that might influence differences in emissions.
Yeah, I agree with everything just mentioned. Certainly there are different practices, different equipment. I mentioned some examples that we've seen this evolution in the DJ Basin, for example, from, green completions with separators, but on-site tank storage and some venting where we saw large emissions, and now, closed loop tankless systems where they move those fluids off pad to handle them somewhere else. And of course, this has greatly reduced the emissions on the pad. It doesn't necessarily tell you what's happening at the other end of that pipeline where these fluids are going. One thing that's really different from basin to basin is the extent of flaring that happens, and that has its own, emissions, especially around black carbon, for example, and other things. So, there are just lots of difference in practices. And sometimes I think if we can describe those practices in different basins, we can probably model some of those differences, hopefully reasonably well. But to the extent we don't know details of the practices, it's difficult to represent that.
I wanted to reinforce a point that Dr. Collette made in answering that question, which is that practices change over time. So if you go to a place like, for example, the Permian Basin, where there might be 150,000 well sites, just because that you have a gas well doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to have the same configuration as all other gas wells in the Permian. It depends on when it was constructed, what the practices were for the operations at the time, and so the age of the facilities and when they were constructed can also play a really important role.
Great. There's also a question online that maybe I'll add a little bit to. The question online was, how do you recognize non-routine emissions? Is that based solely on the difference between the modeling and the observational data? And maybe could you also speak to, this is obviously a challenge of trying to understand and quantify those non-routine emissions, if you had ideas of future work that investigators should undertake to better quantify those emissions and impacts to communities, perhaps.
I'll go ahead and begin that and answer in two parts. First, how do we know that there are these non-routine emissions, these emission events? And so they're particularly for looking at methane, and methane is a relatively easy compound to detect. There have been quite literally now millions of observations being made of methane, trying to characterize especially large emission events. And what's found is that these types of events occur all over the world, very different frequencies in different production regions. but they occur all over the world, and we have a sense of what the frequency of these are. Many of these techniques, such as, for example, airborne LiDAR, give us a good sense of what the point of origin of the emissions are, even down to the piece of equipment on the site, so we can get a sense of what might be causing them. So we're beginning to get an idea of the relative probability of these emission events. Just to cite a particular example, airborne LiDAR was used to characterize relatively large emission events greater than 100 kilograms an hour of hydrocarbons coming from these sites, which is an average site level emission for a production site might be on the order of 1 kilogram an hour. So these are large emission events. And over multiple basins in the United States, approximately 1% of the sites that had observations had these emissions that were in excess of 100 kilograms an hour, which would be defined by the US EPA as a so-called super emitter. So observational evidence tells us about frequency. How do we begin to understand these? And I think Dr. Collette was hinting at what I also believe to be the case, that that if we begin to really account for the design of these facilities, we can look at those designs and look not only for what the routine emissions are, but we can also look for what the potentials for malfunctions are. That's a process that's well understood and well practiced in the safety community. You can look at various threats, malfunctions, failures that lead to various types of consequences, develop probabilities for them, and then put in place either preventive barriers or mitigative barriers that would reduce those emissions. And for these unintended failures, much as we do for safety, I think we can begin to develop procedures for estimating what the most likely routes for these would be, and then how to mitigate those. But that will require a pretty sophisticated understanding of the design of these facilities, as Dr. Collette was pointing out.
Great. There's also a question in the chat on when we might expect to be able to access the tool, where it would be available, and maybe we can also start thinking ahead to what are the biggest needs to continue improving this model, to be able to think about some of these changes over time, changes between basins, et cetera.
So I can begin maybe with our pre-production tracer model. So if somebody's interested in trying this out, I think we're happy to share it. It's sort of it's not officially a beta release, but we can think of it that way. We definitely want feedback. I think we'll roll it out more officially and more broadly once our final report to HEI finishes the peer review and gets released. But if the person that wrote this question or somebody else is interested to try it, definitely happy to work with you on that.
They should email you.
Yeah.
And I'll make the same offer, but again, point out that we want to make sure we go through HEI's rigorous peer review process before we broadly disseminate things. So if we were to release it before HEI has finalized its review of this work, then we would do that, making sure that it isn't widely disseminated and only for really interested parties who have a need to look at things before HEI completes its review.
Anyone want to give some thoughts on what are kind of the biggest priorities for future work to improve the model?
I'll offer up one thing, well, so certainly the last administration put in a lot of regulations for oil and gas activities that would substantially reduce routine emissions. And assuming those regulations stay in place, then more and more the unusual emissions, the malfunctions, in some cases maintenance events, other things, will become a larger and larger fraction of the total. And so continuing to make progress on those types of emissions will be a big need going forward.
Mentioned a couple of examples in sort of the pre-production space for sort of near field impacts. You know, one is, I think we still need to better understand the emissions associated with drilling mud recycling operations. So, you know, when the drilling mud and the drill cuttings come up out of the well, they go across the shaker and to try and do some separation. And often there's 1 or 2 stages of centrifuges that do it further. And then, you know, they sit in a bin before they get trucked off. And I think we don't understand the details of emissions from that very well in terms of the magnitude and how it depends on things like the temperature at which those things emerge from the wellbore, the rate of drilling that, you know, presumably influences the rate of drilling mud coming out. We haven't looked in as much detail at those kinds of things. And then on the flowback side, you know, these closed loop tankless systems, as I show, have been really effective in reducing average emissions, but we definitely see points there where, you know, they have to trap sand that's coming back at the wellbore, and they have to periodically empty these sand traps or sand canisters. And there are different practices around how that's done and how long it takes and what the emissions like, but we still see very large pulses of emissions for short periods during that, you know, we have captured in a few cases, but I wouldn't say we have a really good predictive basis to say exactly what that looks like and how much variability there is from site to site.
Great. Since we're out of questions in the Q&A and almost out of time, I'll turn it back to Gabriela to wrap us up. You're muted.
Thank you. I was just thanking everybody for their presentations and thanking you all for attending this webinar on HEI and community exposures to air emissions from oil and gas development. This webinar will be available on HEI's website in the coming weeks. If you want to continue to follow our activities related to this project, you can sign up for updates from the energy program at the link listed here. I'd like to quickly share what's next for HEI Energy. So as I said, the recording will be available on our website soon. The recording for the first part of this series, where all TRACER PIs as well as NASA HACAS Tiger team provided an overview of their monitoring efforts, is already available on the event section of our site. We will host community open houses for the TRACER study locations in March and April of this year. HEI's 2025 annual conference will be taking place in Austin in May. And additionally, final reports will be coming in 2025, which will all be available on our website. And in the meanwhile, you can sign up for updates. And finally, here's more information about each of the projects located on their websites. Thank you once again, and please complete the feedback survey in the chat, and there will also be a second chance to do so in a follow-up email we're sending later on. We appreciate your feedback and thank you for joining us. And this concludes the TRACER webinar series. Thank you.